Well, hello, we're back again. We're going to learn more about the peripheral nervous system. And today we're going to talk about the spinal nerves as well as begin the autonomic nervous system. So we'll get right to it. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We have 5 types. And they're named for the divisions of the spinal cord from which they originate. We have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. By the way, the word coccygeal looks kind of weird. It comes from the word coccyx, which, as you know, is the tailbone. So it's an adjective having to do with the coccyx. Now, you may be tempted to think that you would have the same number of spinal nerves as you do of each type of vertebra, but that's not right. Well, it's right for 3 out of the 5, I guess. But for the cervical nerves, you have 8 pairs and not 7. And that's because one pair comes off the spinal cord actually above the level of C1, you see. And so they go all the way down to between C7 and T1. So that makes 8. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 thoracics. We have 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and then the only other one that's different from the number of vertebrae would be the coccygeal. As opposed to having 3 or 4 of those, we only have a single pair of coccygeal nerves. And all of these are mixed in function, or both, which means they're both sensory and motor. So look at the bottom. I don't want you to forget about the word ganglion. And a ganglion, as you know, is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. And so alongside the spinal cord, we have what's called dorsal root ganglia, which are regions, these are areas where your sensory component of your spinal nerves are coming in and synapsing, they're coming in and sending their axons toward the spinal cord. And so these are coming from your general senses in your skin, also from proprioceptive organs. And I'd like you to, I'm not sure I've really delved into that with this PowerPoint. I'd like you to kind of look into that, and I'll try to remember to mention that in another venue. So let's look at our distribution of our nerves then. We have something called, well, let's look at the right first. We have our cranial nerves, which are not spinal nerves, by the way, but there they are. All of them, we don't really see them well in that picture. We have 8 pairs of cervical, 12 thoracic, just like I had said a moment ago. I want you to notice something really interesting. The spinal cord doesn't go all the way down to the coccyx, which is what you might have thought. The spinal cord actually ends between L1 and L2, and that's pretty far up in the middle of the back. And so what happens is you have a differential growth rate between the growth of the vertebral column and the spinal cord itself. It's as if well, I can't think of the right analogy, but the spinal cord doesn't become as long. It doesn't grow as rapidly as your vertebrae, and so therefore the lower nerve pairs are going to come down at an angle. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, come at an angle like that. At the very top in the cervical area, they come straight off. But the farther down you go, the more slanted those nerves are. And they're coming, I've got it backwards, but they're coming off like that. And you can kind of see that in that picture if you look at the sacral plexus and those nerves emerging from it. So we have the word plexus. All of our spinal nerves, except for thoracic, actually form plexi or plexuses. And these are regions where you have redistribution of some of the fibers. So you'll have some fibers that begin as cervical nerve 1 or 2 that actually end up emerging from a different area that make it look like it's actually coming from a different level of the spinal cord. And that's actually a really good thing because you've got overlap of function in that way. But so we have a brachial plexus, a cervical plexus, and a lumbosacral plexus. The well, let's see. So this picture shows you the plexi. It shows you the thoracic nerves that are going to become the intercostal nerves, or they are the intercostal nerves. And then it shows you a few of the peripheral nerves. Now this picture to me is a little bit misleading, and I guess it's because she's turned, you see. So it doesn't look exactly totally correct, but it's because she's turned. Right. So this talks about the plexuses. It says we're going to study these in the lab, and we're not, because I had a change of plans. We ended up doing something different in the lab. You know, we've had our brain and our nervous system lab, and then we have our cardiovascular one that should be in progress as we speak. So we're not going to have this in lab after all. But I have a website or a URL that you can click on. I'm not actually sure it's clickable, but you can copy and paste it into a browser, and you can read about it that way. I will have handouts for you if necessary on these plexuses. I think that would be a great idea, in fact. So, and all of the spinal nerves are mixed. They have both sensory and motor components. Another thing I want you to remember about the spinal nerves is how do they get away from the spinal cord? You know, the spinal cord is going to contain those lower motor neurons and the sensory first order neurons and what have you. But these nerves then emerge from the spinal cord through what's called the intervertebral foramina. These are little openings on either side of each vertebra, and it's really formed between an upper and a lower vertebra on each side. But it forms a little rounded opening, and that's where these nerves are going to emerge from the spinal column. Now, I wanted to talk about a reflex for just a moment. You, I'm sure, are familiar with a reflex. That's an automatic motion or a response to a stimulus that does not require the brain. It does require the central nervous system, but you know, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and so it doesn't rise to the brain level. So let's look at the components of this particular one. Look on your right at the top, and you may recognize that as a little section of skin, and you have different cutaneous receptors, receptors that are sending their dendrite away from those cell bodies. And so you look in red, you notice the little arrow in red, it's going up towards the spinal cord. And so there's the dorsal root ganglion. So the this dendrite is going to come on up, and you notice where it goes through what's called the dorsal root, then it gets to the cell body of the neuron, and that is in the dorsal root ganglion. So you'll recognize those as being unipolar neurons, and you'll remember that the unipolar neurons are always sensory. So now it's difficult to see it really because of the line that goes to cell body of neuron, but there is the axon that's coming away from it, and it is going on towards the spinal cord, and that is carrying then the impulse on to the spinal cord. And you know what's happening at the at the level of the cell nucleus, or I'm sorry, not the cell nucleus, at the ganglion. There's going to be graded potential generated. There's going to be an action potential generated, and then that message is going to go on into the spinal cord proper. Now look inside the spinal cord. I want you to get oriented to the spinal cord. Look to where it says dorsal to your left. It's right under the word white matter. So that's the dorsal area of the spinal cord, and then on the opposite side would be the ventral area. And you notice the butterfly-like shape. It's sort of a darker brown color. That is the gray matter of your spinal cord. And the gray matter consists, as you know, of neuron cell bodies. And so this is beginning to make a little more sense to you probably. So now let's go back and look. Oh, by the way, surrounding the gray matter, then you would have white matter. And you remember what white matter is, I bet. That's the myelinated tracts. Remember? So it's tracts now. Inside the CNS, it's tracts. So let's look back to the gray matter. And this would be on that person's left side. And remember, this is that spinal cord is in anatomical position in a way. It's kind of tilted a little bit, but it is in anatomical position. So the dorsal root ganglion we're looking at is of one of the left spinal nerves. So anyway, back to the gray matter of the spinal cord, though. You notice that you have the red sensory axon coming in, and then you have a blue axon emerging, and between the two you see a little green neuron. This is called an interneuron or an association neuron, or it's called internuncial neuron. It has a bunch of names, but this is a neuron that is going to allow the sensory nerve and a motor sensory neuron and a motor neuron to communicate with one another. And so that message then is going to go out what's called the ventral root of this spinal nerve, and it is going to go out to the effector. You notice that it's a muscle there. It looks like a skeletal muscle. It is, because it says somatic, doesn't it? So what I was saying, though, is that that little inner neuron that allows the two neurons to communicate with each other, it is modulating that signal, and it's also allowing communication with other regions. So there will be a message going up to the brain saying, oh, someone just pinched me, or I just stepped on a tack, or whatever. But that impulse is going to be really slow, and before you ever realize, really slow comparatively speaking, before you realize that you were touched, or you had a painful stimulus arrive somewhere, but by the time you realize it, you've already moved the area. But and the reason for that is that you have communication with other regions, but these fibers are slower fibers. So look at your cell body, the blue one. That is a motor neuron. This is called a lower motor neuron, right? And the lower motor neuron in the blue, it is controlled by the corticospinal tracts, okay? But it also has independent control, and that is through a reflex arc, and that's what we're talking about right now. It was just tempting to revisit that since we had the anatomy so shown there. So the lower motor neuron is in the blue. The impulse goes out the ventral root of that spinal nerve. This is a motor axon, motor neuron. You see that it is supplying those muscle fibers, and it is going to cause that person to react to that stimulus. If it's a painful stimulus or a change in temperature or what have you, it might cause you to withdraw that part. If it is some other kind of stimulus, it might cause a different sort of reaction. But a reflex arc has usually 5 parts. It will have the receptor, and it'll have the sensory neuron. It will have the interneuron, and it'll have the motor neuron. And then finally, the effector. So we have the sensory receptor, the sensory neuron, the interneuron, the motor neuron, and the effector. And in some cases, the interneuron is not there. It's just there's a 4-component arc in that case. Okay, and so here it is, the reflex arc. Sensory, afferent neuron, interneuron, efferent neuron, and then the effector. So a reflex, again, is an unconscious motor response to a sensory stimulus. And we have two kinds of reflexes. You can have the spinal reflex, which is what we were looking at. You can also have an autonomic one, and we'll be talking about those. You can have a stimulus from inside the body, as you know. So what if I'm sitting here and all of a sudden I decide to get up rather suddenly, and just for a second I feel sort of dizzy, and then by the time I say, "Oh, I'm dizzy," it's gone. If you've ever had that happen, you are experiencing, well, by the time you realize you have it, you don't have it anymore. What you are experiencing there is a reflex that is going on, and what happens is there are some little receptors inside our blood vessels that say, "Oh my goodness, our blood pressure has dropped all of a sudden. What are we to do? We've got to make some adjustments." And so the adjustments are made rapidly to get more blood to the brain, and then everything corrects itself. And so that is an autonomic reflex, and we'll go through that one more carefully when we do autonomic system, which is coming up soon. So let's look at our some of our spinal reflexes. The one that we're familiar with probably is the patellar tendon reflex. You remember the patellar tendon? It attaches to the patella, and then the patella then attaches to the tibial tuberosity by way of a ligament. But if you tap on that patellar ligament, it causes a stretching of the uh, patellar tendon from the quadriceps muscles, and then that is going to initiate that reflex arc. There's a plantar reflex in which you can stroke the bottom of the foot, and it can cause variable responses depending on the age of the individual. There's a biceps reflex, a triceps one, abdominal reflexes, many, many other types of reflexes. So now let's look at the autonomic system. Again, this is part of our peripheral nervous system. This is sometimes called the visceral efferent system. Visceral has to do with the organs. Efferent has to do with motor, because it controls your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and your glands. Now here's the thing, there are some sensory components, so it's not all visceral efferent, it's mainly visceral efferent, okay? So smooth muscle is located in a surprisingly large number of locations in the body. Here are a few places. All of your hollow viscera, such as the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, the bile ducts, the gallbladder, the urinary bladder, the uterus, the bronchioles, all of these have smooth muscle in their walls, and they are all controlled by the autonomic nervous system. We have ducts in the reproductive system. We have digestive ducts. We have some autonomic fibers going to the eye. So where it says radial and sphincter muscles of the iris, those are what are going to dilate and constrict the pupil. From the oculomotor nerve, remember the ciliary muscle is going to be the one that governs the shape of the lens. So all of those places and more is where you have smooth muscle. For example, you have it in your blood vessel walls. You have smooth muscle in the spleen capsule. Lots of different other places that are not listed. So the simplest, you could call it the functional unit of the autonomic nervous system, could be a 2-neuron sequence. And it consists of a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. And so it's similar to presynaptic and postsynaptic. In fact, they are presynaptic and postsynaptic. But we call them preganglionic and postganglionic because of the ganglion there. And you know what a ganglion is? Collection of cell bodies outside the CNS, right? So there may be more than one. There usually is going to be more than one presynaptic and many, many more postsynaptic neurons. But the simplest form, and there are a few in the parasympathetic division that are almost this simple, but the simplest form would be one presynaptic and one preganglionic and one postganglionic neuron. So look at your preganglionic neuron. We want to look at the location of the cell body of the preganglionic neuron. We want to look at the location of the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, which would be in the ganglion itself. We want to look at the neurotransmitter that's released from the preganglionic neuron. We want to look at the receptors that are going to combine with the neurotransmitter. We want to look at the neuroeffector junction, which is where the postganglionic neuron is going to synapse with the effector, which would be like the walls of the uterus or the SA node of the heart or what have you. So we are going to look at all of these things, and all of this is going to help you to get a handle on it, because autonomic system can be a little bit ephemeral, just a little bit difficult sometimes to understand. So the more visual things you have to go along with the descriptions and the functions, the better it's going to be. So let's look at our little boxes. Under preganglionic neuron, it says in the PSNS, the preganglionic neuron cell bodies are craniosacral in location. Now, notice something. Many people and most books will abbreviate parasympathetic nervous system as PNS. But some of us like to use the designation PSNS because it stands out, parasympathetic nervous system. Otherwise, you could get that confused pretty easily if it stands for two different things, peripheral nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So PSNS is what I'm going with. Some of my slides may have otherwise, because I may have gotten them from another source. But at any rate, let's look back at the box. PSNS, craniosacral cell bodies. We're going to see a picture of this in a minute, but what does cranial mean? Cranio means the head. Sacral means the sacrum of the spinal column. So that's where your preganglionic neuron cell bodies are going to be located. Okay, and so they are going to be in the central nervous system, but the rest of it will be in the peripheral system. In the SNS, which means sympathetic nervous system, these cell bodies are thoracolumbar in location. This means in the thoracic part of the cord and the lumbar part of the spinal cord. Let's look at the ganglia. Okay, in the parasympathetic, let's see what I have here. Craniosacral in location. Postganglionic neuron. Okay, I don't like the way that's stated very much. I'm going to have to sort of amend what that says for you. The postganglionic neuron is going to be, cell body is going to be in the ganglion. And the ganglia have different locations. For the sympathetic system, there are three main locations for the ganglia, and this is on another slide. We have our sympathetic ganglia in a sympathetic chain alongside the spinal cord. We have collateral ganglia, and then we have the adrenal medulla, which is also a modified sympathetic ganglion. So we have several locations for sympathetic ganglia. We have another location for the parasympathetic, and it's called terminal ganglia. And that means that the ganglion is located on the surface or near the surface of the organ being innervated. Now, if it sounds like I'm speaking Greek right now, I guess I sort of am. I've got some Greek letters up there. Look at the effector at the bottom of the diagram. Look where I've kind of written in the M for M receptors, and on the right side I've got the little Greek letter alpha and the Greek letter beta receptors. Our autonomic receptors at the neuroeffector junction are named like that with Greek letters, or at least the adrenergic ones are. So let's see what I'm missing here. Let's look at the preganglionic neuron. Let's look at its neuron terminal and see inside the green circle, that is going to be the ganglion. And ordinarily there would be many postganglionic neuron cell bodies in that ganglion. But look at the preganglionic cell. It's releasing little triangles that are representing acetylcholine, which is abbreviated ACH. and that is the neurotransmitter at the ganglion for both divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic. The receptor is called the NN receptor, or the little N stands for nervous system, or it also stands for ganglionic, even though it doesn't say G on it, does it? That acetylcholine is combining with a receptor, and it's going to cause graded potentials, right? And it depends on the post-ganglionic cell as to whether it's going to be excitatory in that cell or inhibitory. But at any rate, it's going to be the same neurotransmitter in both divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So at that point, graded potentials are generated. They travel around that cell body in the ganglion, and then an action potential is generated. You know this well by this point. The action potential travels down the axon to the neuroeffector junction, and I've got that circled in yellow. Okay, neuroeffector means it is where a neuron is going to synapse with an effector. Pretty easy, you know, like a smooth muscle or cardiac tissue or what have you. And so on that effector then is where we have the alpha and beta receptors, and the M, it's called muscarinic receptors. Look at that, we have acetylcholine again being released. It's being released by the postganglionic cell as well. And it's the same molecule, same acetylcholine as it was at the ganglion. Well, different molecules, but it's the same chemical. And you see that that is combining with a different kind of receptor called an M cholinergic receptor, or M muscarinic receptor, and it is going to cause a response. So this is at the neuroeffector junction. On the right, you see the little purple circles, and those are abbreviated NE, which stands for norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is going to combine with either an alpha or a beta receptor on the effector surface. Now, if this is about as clear as mud, I would totally understand. So we're going to keep looking at this. So we're going to back up. We'll come back and revisit that in a moment. We have two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic one and the parasympathetic one. Sympathetic is what we call the fight or flight system. It's also called the thoracolumbar system. And the thoracolumbar designation means the location of the preganglionic cell bodies. Remember that? In the thoracic and lumbar part of the spinal cord. The parasympathetic nervous system is called the craniosacral system because the cell bodies, the preganglionic cell bodies, are either in the brain or in the sacral part of the spinal cord. Now, there's not a really good designation that kind of is a counterpart to fight or flight, but some people have called this the rest and digest division, R-E-S-T, rest and digest. And that implies that it's a more calming influence. This one is going to be in control when you're not under the gun, you're not in fight or flight. And so we have those two divisions then.